All right, my name's Clayton Conley. Today I'm going to be talking about Japanese occupation in Korea. So this is kind of a controversial thing. First I wanted to talk about a little bit about the background. So in 1910, there was a treaty signed where Korea was formally annexed to Japan. And for the next 35 years, Korea was considered, I guess 5 years before that, it was a proctorate. So it then became a part of Japan. It was a colony. It was the end of the Joseon dynasty. So Hojong was the last Daewang, or he wasn't a Daewang even. He was the last emperor. And so anyway, there are three periods of occupation. There's military, cultural, and then war mobilization. I'm going to be focusing mostly on what sort of things happened during the occupation, particularly how it helped Korea modernize. So, a couple of the things that happened, negative things, are listed here. During Cultural Revolution, they ordered everyone to change their names from Korean names to Japanese names. That was really a difficult thing for people to do because they felt like they were turning their backs on their ancestry. Newspaper and literature were censored during this time also, and during the because of the national mobilization law, people were forced into labor. Comfort women, which I could talk to you a whole lot about, but I won't go into that because it's also something that's still very controversial today, and forced enlistment of Korean soldiers. So, I want to talk about a couple of things that actually the Japanese occupation were beneficial to Korea. So this is, I think, something that we don't focus on a lot. So I'll kind of give two sides of the story here. So during the time of Japanese occupation, Japan had actually, they had modernized about 60 years before Korea started modernizing, and during the Meiji Restoration. So they opened their ports to Western people, they started trading, and then they started emulating a lot of things that Western cultures did. During the time that they were in Korea, they actually helped with infrastructure and also setting up a more Western style of government. Because I guess the Japanese were very similar to Korea in that resources they didn't have very many natural resources. They needed strong, structured, and centralized governing bodies. So this was something that the Korean government today is still very patterned after. So it's interesting to see the legacy there. Also, institutions that the Koreans adopted resembled more the Japanese institutions they had known through the colonialism of the 1930s and 40s than after than Japan's post-war variants. So like the institutions that Japan had back in the 30s and 40s are very similar to the ones that Korea have today. One example of this is South Korean governments establishing the Reconstruction Bank to help finance South Korea's reconstruction after the Korean War. It is exactly the same name, and it has the same sort of governing body as the Japanese Reconstruction Bank that helped them reconstruct after World War II. Let's see. So these developments were essential in propelling Korea into the League of Developed Nations. So this really, the base here, I mean, the Koreans obviously suffered, but this is something good that came out of their suffering. Education also changed during this time drastically. So before there was Sodam, which was a Confucian style of education where everyone would listen to the teacher up in the front and he would teach them from Confucian classics. During the time of Japanese occupation, they allowed public education, which was something very new. Before, the Yongbun elite were the only people who were offered education. And during this time, anyone who wanted to be educated could be educated. The downside here was that they had to have a Japanese-style education, which meant that there was a point where actually they were taught completely in Japanese. A lot of them actually forgot Korean, which is kind of sad, and they had to relearn Korean after the occupation was done. And then also, they weren't treated very well, but it did provide everyone with the equal opportunity to have an education, which is something that was very new to Korea. Another thing about this style of education is that it didn't just focus on Confucian classics, it focused on things that were more scientific, like math, engineering, and things like that would be essential for helping Korea modernize. So some of the, let's see. That's all I can say about that. Economics. So this was a big one too. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the Korean idea of chaebol, or conglomerates. Companies like you can see up here, LG, Hyundai, Samsung, and I think that's Lotte, right? Lotte, that is. These are examples of conglomerates. So what they basically are, they're state-owned enterprises. So the government has had really big control. Now they don't anymore. But in the initial stages, to help them grow so that they can become internationally competitive companies. And this system is identical to the Japanese equivalent called the Zaibatsu. And I think it's actually the same Hanja, or the same Japanese that it comes from, or same Korean, Chinese, there we go. Same Chinese roots that it comes from. This system was essential, actually, even now it's still very prevalent in Korea in making them internationally competitive because Korea is a very export-oriented country. I could talk to you more about this, but we don't have much time, do we? So moving on. So this brings me to my conclusion that the Japanese did have a big influence on Korean modernization, but it's just as arguable that Korean Confucianism, things that were traditionally Korean, were the main factor behind all of these things. So for example, going back to government, the idea that Confucianism teaches the importance of the individual as a part of a whole, and this was it was a key element in South Korea's rapid economic growth. Confucianism teaches that you should have a healthy work ethic. It also teaches people to be pragmatic and to be optimistic. I could go more in detail about that, but I'm going to talk about the balance between Li and Gi, which are very interesting. And then Confucianism was arguably just as important in modernizing South Korea as Japanese occupation because it teaches the importance of the individual as part of the whole. This was essential during Park Chung-hee's rule, where he implemented a lot of, I guess if you were more individualistic, it wouldn't have been possible sort of policies, where he would make people work for a long amount of time, and it actually brought Korea out of poverty up into an economic powerhouse. And as a result, they were able to, you see Korea today, it's amazing how fast they've modernized. Let's see. So in conclusion, though Confucianism, let's see. So here we are. Though it's irrefutable that the Japanese occupation did play a big role in modernizing South Korea, Confucianism arguably played just as major a role in the current success of South Korea. And though it's beyond the scope of my presentation here to discuss which contributed more to South Korean modernization, there's one common theme in both arguments: the resiliency of the Korean people. So despite the adversity that they had to undergo during times of Japanese occupation, they were able to learn the best things, and they were able to emulate them, and they were able to succeed because of it. And that's also something that's very Confucian. In the face of adversity, the Korean people were resilient. They were learning lessons from unpleasant past, and it allowed them to grow